The concert hall was packed, the lights dimmed, and all eyes turned to the grand piano at the center of the stage. Tonight was supposed to be a showcase of pure talent, a place where music itself would speak louder than pride. At one side stood an elitist pianist, a man known not only for his flawless technique, but also for the arrogance that often followed him. He carried himself as though no one else in the room could ever match his skill. For years, he had belittled anyone he thought beneath him, convinced that true artistry was reserved only for the privileged few. Across from him sat a woman who looked nothing like the usual performers. She was simple, dressed modestly, and quiet in her demeanor. Many in the audience whispered, wondering what she was even doing on that stage. To the arrogant pianist, she seemed like an easy opponent, someone he could humiliate and brush aside without breaking a sweat. With a smirk, he challenged her to a piano duel, certain that this night would only further elevate his reputation. But what he didn't know was that behind her unassuming presence lay years of practice, discipline, and a love for music that burned far deeper than any ego could ever carry. As she placed her hands on the keys, the room fell silent. The pianist leaned back, smug and sure of his victory, while the crowd waited for the first note. What happened next would shock everyone, including the man who had mocked her. Because the moment she began to play, something shifted in the air, something powerful, something unforgettable. And in that instant, the elitist pianist realized too late that this duel was not going to end the way he had imagined. The audience leaned forward, unsure what to expect. The woman's posture was calm, almost too calm, as though she wasn't facing a duel at all, but simply about to share something deeply personal. The elitist pianist, meanwhile, tapped his fingers on the edge of the piano bench, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of mockery and impatience. For him, this was just another opportunity to prove that talent belonged to those who came from wealth, status, and years of polished training under famous teachers. But the woman's story was far different. She hadn't grown up in prestigious music schools or with grand halls at her disposal. Her piano was an old, slightly broken one, tucked away in a modest home where every note carried the weight of sacrifice and persistence. She had played for herself, for her family, and for the quiet joy that music gave her in the hardest of times. What she lacked in luxury, she had gained in heart. Each chord she had ever practiced carried not only discipline, but also emotion. Whispers rippled through the hall. Some doubted she could even last a round against him. Others, noticing the steady focus in her eyes, felt there might be something unusual about her calmness. The elitist pianist, catching those glances, grew irritated. He raised his chin, ready to remind everyone why his name carried prestige, why he believed no ordinary woman could rival him. The stage lights caught a soft gleam on the piano keys as her fingers hovered above them. Time seemed to stretch. The duel wasn't just about music anymore. It was about pride, about dignity, and about proving that greatness doesn't always come from where people expect. And with the next note, the truth was about to unfold. The first notes from her hands were gentle, almost hesitant, yet they carried something the audience didn't expect. It wasn't just music, it was emotion wrapped in every sound, telling stories words could never capture. The hall grew so quiet that even the smallest breath seemed loud. The elitist pianist, still wearing his smug expression, leaned back as if unimpressed, but inside he felt an odd unease. There was a depth in her playing that technique alone could not create, something raw and unpolished, but deeply human. For the audience, the duel began to take on a new meaning. Some remembered their own struggles, their own quiet battles, as her music seemed to reach into hidden corners of the heart. A young student in the back, who had been discouraged from chasing her dream of music because she couldn't afford lessons, found hope in those notes. An older man, once a musician himself before life forced him onto a different path, felt memories stir he thought were long buried. This simple woman wasn't just competing, she was awakening something within every listener. The pianist, however, was battling more than just the notes. His pride was now at stake, his reputation balanced on a fragile edge. He told himself that once it was his turn again, he would drown her out with speed, precision, and mastery. Yet a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how perfect his performance, the audience had already begun to shift toward her. As her melody rose higher, it seemed almost like a conversation, her piano speaking truths about resilience, love, and loss. Each chord carried weight, each pause held meaning, and though the duel had just begun, everyone sensed this was no ordinary contest. Something much greater was unfolding, and no one knew how it would end. The final notes of her passage lingered in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. The audience sat frozen, their eyes locked on the woman whose hands now rested quietly on the keys. For a moment, no one even clapped. It wasn't silence born of indifference, but of awe, an unspoken acknowledgement that something remarkable had just happened. The elitist pianist, however, forced a thin smile and rose slightly from his bench, determined to reclaim the stage. He straightened his jacket and cracked his knuckles with exaggerated flair, signaling that it was his turn to remind the world of his dominance. His fingers flew across the keys with speed and precision, every note sharp and commanding, as if each sound was a weapon aimed directly at her. The hall thundered with his performance, powerful and flawless, designed to overwhelm. The audience gasped at the sheer force of his playing, yet some still glanced back at the simple woman, as though comparing his brilliance to the quiet magic they had just heard. Tension rippled through the room. This wasn't only a duel of skill anymore. It had become a battle of values, of what music truly meant. Was it about mastery and control, or about emotion and connection? The audience leaned forward, torn between admiration for his perfection and the lingering warmth of her melody. The woman's eyes never wavered. She sat calmly, listening, as though his storm of notes couldn't shake her resolve. Her stillness itself became unsettling, a silent challenge stronger than words. The pianist noticed it too. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. He played louder, faster, desperate to cover that shadow of insecurity. The hall vibrated with sound, every heart pounding in sync with the clash of pride and passion. Everyone knew the climax was near. The duel was reaching its breaking point, and the next moment would decide whose music would truly last. Just as the pianist struck his final, thunderous chord, the hall erupted in applause. But it wasn't the overwhelming victory he had hoped for. The clapping felt divided, polite for him, yet heavy with anticipation for her. He bowed stiffly, trying to mask the frustration building inside. He had delivered perfection, but perfection suddenly seemed hollow. The woman rose slowly, her calmness unshaken, and returned to the piano. But instead of immediately playing, she did something unexpected. She closed her eyes, lifted her hands, and for a long moment let the silence breathe. The audience leaned forward, unsettled yet drawn in. This wasn't just her turn. It felt like she was rewriting the rules of the duel itself. The elitist pianist shifted uncomfortably, realizing she was about to take the stage in a way he couldn't predict. Then she began to play, not just with skill, but with a boldness no one expected. Her fingers danced with intensity, blending technical precision with raw emotion, creating a storm that rivaled his own but carried something deeper. It was as though her music was answering his, challenging every note he had played. The duel was no longer one-sided. She wasn't just matching him, she was surpassing him in a way he hadn't imagined possible. The tension thickened when a group of judges, who had been quietly observing from the back rows, began to take notes. This duel, once thought to be an informal showcase, now had consequences the pianist hadn't considered. Whispers spread quickly. Sponsors, opportunities, and reputations were on the line. The elitist pianist realized this was no longer just about pride. It could alter his standing in the music world. The stakes had risen higher than anyone expected. Every note now carried the weight of destiny, and the air trembled with the question: who would truly own the stage when the final chord was struck? Her music rose to its peak, each note carrying a force that shook the hall to its core. It was no longer the sound of a simple woman, but the voice of an artist pouring her soul into every key. The audience leaned forward, their hearts pulled into the storm she created. When the final note faded into silence, it was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Then came the eruption, applause so loud, so unrestrained, that it drowned out the very memory of the pianist's earlier performance. The elitist pianist sat frozen, his hands trembling just above the keys. He had always believed music was about control, speed, and flawless execution. But in that moment, he understood something he had spent his whole career ignoring. She hadn't just outplayed him, she had reached people in a way he never could. And worse, he knew the audience had felt it too. His pride cracked under the weight of her triumph. The judges stood, and for the first time in years, their verdict was unanimous. They named her the winner of the duel, praising not only her skill, but the depth of feeling in her playing. Gasps and cheers filled the hall as the woman bowed, still modest. Her victory carried not in arrogance, but in grace. The pianist's face flushed with shame, knowing his reputation would never be the same. But then came the twist. Instead of celebrating her own win, the woman turned back to him and invited him to play alongside her for one final piece. The audience held their breath. It was not a challenge, but an offering, a chance to create music together, not as rivals, but as equals. In that moment, the duel transformed into something far greater than defeat or victory. It became redemption. The pianist hesitated, unsure if his pride would allow him to accept her invitation. For years, he had stood above others, convinced that humility was weakness. Yet now, with the audience waiting in silence and the woman's steady gaze meeting his, he realized this was not humiliation. It was a chance to rediscover what music was truly about. Slowly, he nodded, and together they sat at the piano. When their hands touched the keys side by side, something remarkable happened. Their music blended into a harmony that carried both her depth and his precision, creating a performance unlike anything the audience had ever heard. The hall, once tense with rivalry, now filled with a powerful sense of unity. The applause that followed wasn't just for her or for him. It was for the beauty they had created together. As the final echoes faded, the elitist pianist stood and bowed, not in arrogance this time, but in respect. For the first time in his career, he acknowledged that talent was not defined by status or background, but by passion and the ability to touch hearts. The woman, still humble, simply smiled, her victory not in defeating him, but in changing him. The judges, the audience, even the students who had once doubted their own paths, walked away with a new understanding. Music was not about being better than others, but about connection, resilience, and the courage to share one's story. That night, the simple woman left the stage not just as the winner of a piano duel, but as a symbol of what true artistry means. And the once arrogant pianist, now humbled, carried with him a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. A reminder that the greatest music begins not in the hands, but in the heart.